Hello and welcome back. In the last videos, we've talked about how to write a simple Hello World program using the C and the Java programming language. And essentially what we've done is we've called a function, printLine, and we've just given that function as a parameter a string literal. Now, what do we do though if we want to use a string literal, the same string literal, in this case Hello World, somewhere later on in the program, perhaps several times? Do we always have to copy and paste that same string literal whenever we want to use it? Not necessarily, because that's where the concept of variables comes in. Now, variables are one of the most basic concepts in programming. In fact, I can't think of a single programming language out of my head that does not support variables. But first of all, if you're coming from mathematics, say linear algebra or calculus, then you might want to forget what you think a variable means for a minute, because in computer science, a variable is not the same thing as in mathematics. Essentially, in computer science, a variable is just a container that stores a piece of data, and you can put a label on that container. And that's basically it. Now, you can always interchange the piece of data that is stored inside that variable. There's a special form of variable called constant, where you cannot change the data anymore. But we'll talk a bit more about that later on. Now, depending on the programming language, the values that you can store in a variable are limited by the data type that that variable can hold. Java is one of those languages where you have to, when you declare a variable, you have to also declare what data type it can hold. So say we create an integer variable. We could only store integer values inside that integer variable. So we couldn't store a boolean inside there, for example. Neither could we store a string. But in the same manner, if we create a string variable, we couldn't store an integer in there. When we want to use a variable, we have to go through two hoops. But basically, when we really use variables, we just combine them into one step. The first step would be to initialize or to declare that variable. The purpose of that is basically we tell the computer beforehand, listen buddy, you got to reserve a certain amount of space where we are going to later on put some piece of data inside there. That's basically it. And for example, in Java, the computer would know that it would have to reserve a certain space for a double or an integer value or a boolean. So that's one of the benefits of having to declare what kind of data type a variable can hold. Also, a computer, in Java's case, would check statically when it executes a program if a variable also holds a data type that it has specified. Now, the second step after declaring or initializing a variable is, of course, assignment. So we can put whatever value we want into that variable. So, for example, we could declare an integer variable, then we could assign it the value 1 on the next line, and then we could also on the next line assign it a variable, that same variable, the value 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. We can do that as many times as we want. We cannot do that with a constant though. A constant, just like a variable, has to be declared or initialized, and then you can assign it one value, and that value is then locked. So basically, if we go back to that container analogy, you would also have a label on that container, and you can put data inside, but once you put one piece of data inside, then you can't open it again. It's locked. And where would that come in handy? Well, for example, if you're working with scientific constants, for example, the Avogadro constant, or the speed of light, or the Planck constant. There are many uses for that. Or, for example, if you're working with pi and you have to store your approximation of pi somewhere, why not a constant? You don't have to change that anyways. In fact, it's safer to use constant wherever possible than to just store everything inside of variables. Because a computer can never check if it's a variable. But if it's a constant, a computer, if you're trying to access that constant again, will immediately say, wait, we don't do that here. And that's where the safety part comes from.